Hey guys, this is Tyler Schmidt, Schmitty Racing Suspensions. We wanted to put together a video for a question that we get a lot. We send out lots of spring kits, and a common question that we have is preload. A lot of guys discuss and explain preload as the exposed threads above the preload collar. They give measurements from the bridge down to the preload. And when they talk about crossover ring location, they talk about measurements from the preload collar down to the crossover ring. And we wanted to give you an explanation of how we prescribe and detail the install directions as far as spring stack preload. So we'll jump right into it. When we talk about preload itself, the basis of what we're explaining or describing preload as is the amount of load that's actually on, as you can see here, a completed shock, how much load we've actually put onto the coils themselves before we put them on the car. So this is a shock off of an XP1000 4-seat car. This setup is ready to go, basically to bolt back on the car to check ride height. What you can see here is tender spring, slider, mainspring. So just a kind of a description of the components of what we include in the kit. Upper spring right here is what we would call our tender spring. Obviously the center portion, slider, spring coupler, there's a lot of different names for what people call that, but we call this a slider. And then the bottom spring right here on the shock is going to be your mainspring. Down here you have the rock guard, shaft guard, and then the bottom portion on the bottom of the shock is spring retainer. And then as we go up to the top of the shock, you have preload collar and crossover ring. So just to start out, basically our preload of what we're describing is, like I said, load on the springs themselves. So our starting point or starting measurement of how we would figure out how much load is actually on the coils would be free length. So here we have a 10-inch tender spring. This slider, if you would measure the center portion of it, is going to be a 1/2 inch, and then the bottom mainspring is going to be a 16-inch mainspring. So what you'll see here is if we added that together, a 10-inch tender, 1/2 inch in the middle, and 16-inch in the main, is going to be 26.5 inches of free length spring stack. If you measure now the shock of what we've done, this shock has 1 1/8 of preload. So you'll see that it is at 25 3/8 inches of spring stack when that spring stack is compressed, which again, as we're describing, is free length. So 10-inch, 1/2 inch, 16-inch minus 25 3/8 is going to give you 1.5 or 1.125 of actual load on the coils themselves. So one key point we wanted to add in addition to when you're setting up your spring kit is negative springs or top out springs. So majority of the time you're going to find that on a Fox shock or Walker Evans shock. Some of the new like Turbo R, Pro R models on the front shocks, Turbo S Velocity shocks on the front. And then when you're talking about Fox shocks, it would be Pro R, Turbo R Dynamics, any of the X3 shocks, again, have these negative springs internally. So what we want you to remember is that you're focusing on, again, that finished spring stack, top of tender spring to bottom of mainspring, including those tender spring lengths, that center divider length, and mainspring length, because as you add load to a shock that has a negative spring internally, this spring is going to allow that shaft to continue to extend until the outside spring rate overcomes what that inside rate is. So just a point to keep in mind when you are putting that kit together, that you're not referencing how much you're moving the preload collar from when it first touches the spring to its finish point. We want you, again, measuring that spring stack point, as that's what's going to really dictate what that preload and load amount is on the physical coils themselves. Obviously this spring kit has a slider that has a 1/2 inch center gap in the middle of the springs. This is a slider off of an R-Max. So again, same type of theory of how you would come to that spring stack preload. You would have your tender spring length. The center divider on the R-Max slider is 1 1/8 inch, and the bottom mainspring would be the additional measurement. So again, you take free length of the springs. So on an R-Max, let's say front shock, that would be a 6-inch tender spring. You have 1 1/8 inch of center divider, and then you would have a 14-inch mainspring on the bottom. That's going to give you, give me a second, that would be 21 1/8 of free length, and then you would take that prescribed preload measurement of what we give you off of that and subtract that from that free length measurement. Another slider that we use, this is going to be on like a general 900S Fox model, 1000S Fox model. This portion is going to be 3/8 of a center divider. So again, tender spring plus 3/8 plus mainspring length minus that compressed preload of what we're giving you in the install sheet is again what that final spring stack preload is going to be. The final slider, which would be, this is our slider that we make, but similar dimensions of what you would find on Dynamics Pro R, Turbo R model, Turbo S, rear shock, Turbo S, and that would be on both Velocities and Dynamics models. So center divider length is going to be 3/4 of an inch. So again, tender spring plus 3/4 inch plus mainspring is going to give you your free length of that spring. Subtract that off of the preload net measurement that we're giving you, and that's where you're going to get your actual finished preload measurement of like what we have on this shock. The last couple points about once you get your preload correct, obviously then the last part is going to be setting your crossover gap. So crossover gap is always going to be set with the shock at full extension, and that is going to be the distance from the bottom of your crossover ring to that inside leg of your slider. So if you were to hold that up right here, it'd be the bottom of your crossover ring to the inside leg that's going to be sticking through on the slider. On the R-Max, we have that leg is longer on the top part because of the design of the R-Max shock. The threads are pretty short on the body itself, so we designed a specific slider to accommodate that and still give you that adjustability on your spring kit. And then the last point of when you're installing your spring kit is always making sure your springs are clocked correctly. So as you can see here on the back side of the shock, we want the springs overlapping each other by roughly 3 inches. So where these spring tabs are, we want those tabs to be overlapping each other, not 180 like a lot of other companies tell you. We want them overlapping that 2 to 3 inch mark. We found that by doing this, you minimize the shock body damage, shock body wear that you're going to have, which is why if you've done any amount of research on us online, you can see and find that our spring kits do not have an issue with shock body damage. So thank you guys. Hopefully this is helpful, and if you do ever have any questions, feel free to reach out.